Hello everybody and thank you for joining us. Welcome to our taster session on Introduction to Management. I'm Carly from the main group for anyone who doesn't know me, and welcome to everyone who's joining us on the live stream today. I did have a couple of technical glitches before, so I just wanted to say if you can't hear me, please do pop that in the chat function. I just want to make sure that the audio is working okay. So if everybody can hear me, if they could just say a quick yes in the chat function, and if there are any challenges with the audio, it'd be great if you could just let me know. The chat function you should be able to see on your screen there. And just waiting for a few more people to join us in the live room as well. Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining. Thanks, Kate. Mira, I hope you can see where we are now. Let me know if there's any challenges. But thank you, everybody. Just wanted to make sure that we've got audio, so that's great. And so, as you know, today is going to be a taste session for our really popular Introduction to Management programme. Now, the programme is usually run over a 2-day period, but today we're just doing a very quick whistle-stop tour for about 45 minutes or so, just to give you a taster of the programme and the content. But hopefully you will come away from today with some really key tips and useful insights into what the programme entails. And as we are running this in a webinar format, it's not going to be as interactive as our programs usually would be, but it would be great if anybody does want to make some comments or add any questions or just share anything in the chat. It would be lovely to keep today as interactive as possible. So please do feel free to pop anything in the chat and any questions that you have or anything that you wanted to share with the group, that would be amazing. So, as I say, this is going to be a short version of the usual program today, but hopefully it's still super useful. I've also just realised that I match my slides, which wasn't intentional. I've just seen that on the colours there, so that's quite funny. Anyway, so we are going to be starting with just a little bit of run through of what today's taster session involves. Now, the usual long form course has a number of modules, as you can imagine, over a really comprehensive 2-day programme. But today we're going to be covering a bit about the journey to management and why people sort of are at where they find themselves in a management role. We're going to be talking about the importance of being your authentic self as a manager. We're going to be covering delegation, which is a super useful tool for any manager. And we're going to be covering giving feedback. And we're also talking about the positive feedback and the more constructive feedback. It's a really interesting and useful key tool for any new managers, the feedback one. And then we're going to be talking a bit about approaching difficult conversations. So that's the main areas that we're going to be covering today. So before we get started, as I say, please do put anything in the chat if you've got any questions. It's lovely to meet you all and see your names all coming up in the chat, and please do keep them coming. So we're quite often asked who this programme would be suitable for, and it's actually quite a wide-ranging answer. So as an introduction to management programme, this is obviously a course that's really suitable for new managers, but it's also a super useful refresher course for any experienced managers who've either got gaps in their knowledge or just really want to gen up. It might have been a while since they've done any management training. And as we all know, relearning things and refreshing on things is so important. It's part of your continuing professional development to ensure that you're remembering and relearning things. It's easy to slip into bad habits or just forget things. So this is a really useful refresher program as well. And this is also extremely useful for any HR or L&D professionals, particularly if you're thinking about running this training internally. You could use some tips from this and even run internal workshops on the topic. But I would say this is useful for anybody who's got any line management or supervisory responsibilities in any capacity. It's going to come, anyone who attends this program will come away with useful tools for supervising and line managing. And I actually think this is great for any aspiring managers. So quite often we have really ambitious people who aren't managers yet, but they really know that that's the path they want to go on. And I think this is a great program for them as well. So if you are thinking of running a course like this, I would definitely consider opening it up to aspiring managers as well. So that's who this program would be useful for. And now we're going to talk a little bit about the journey to management. So the journey to management can be a long road at times. And it's actually interesting because there's so many stats that we hear that managers feel that they're often promoted into the role, and it's usually because they're fantastic at what they do, and there's an assumption made that they're going to be great at managing. But obviously this isn't always the case. people say that moving from employee to manager is one of the toughest career transitions that you can have. And it's absolutely true. Quite often, and most of the time, managers are promoted to management and they will also still be expected to carry on doing their day job and take on this extra management responsibility. So doing a dual role in itself is a big enough challenge, but one that you're not necessarily equipped with the tools to do, it can actually cause a lot of strain. So you've done all of this amazing hard work to get to this point of becoming a manager. And then quite often you might find that you're thrown into this position of discomfort, and it can even lead to stress. Managers not being equipped with the right tools early on in their career, we're told, leads managers to feel stress for themselves. It can cause a lot of unrest and discomfort among the team that they're managing, and it can cause difficulties and challenges for leadership as well. So actually, if you think about it, not equipping your managers with the right skills can potentially cause 360-degree stress and chaos, which is something obviously that we want to avoid. And giving managers these skills will give them not only the tools that they need, but also the confidence, because a large part of management is having the confidence that you know what you're doing and that there's not something missing or skills gaps in your knowledge that are going to be holding you back from being an effective manager. And I just wanted to share some stats, which I actually found really interesting. So one report that we read showed that 98% of managers felt that they needed more training, and 2 out of 5 experienced managers cited that they were widely unprepared for taking on a management role when they assumed the position. And also another 80% of middle managers say that they wish that they had received more training at the time that they were promoted. So really interesting that those stats are so high and that this is a really common challenge that organisations and new managers are facing. And little touches like programs like this, or any even internal workshops that you're running, can really help to combat that and give your managers the confidence that they need to do the role. As we've shared, it's a long, hard journey to reach management, and it's not something that you want to derail your high-performing people, particularly as, in some cases, the stress and challenge of becoming a manager whilst doing the day job and feeling unequipped for it can lead even to people who were formerly really high-performing team members leaving the organisation. And sadly as well, quite often what happens is these people say, I don't want to do management anymore, because they didn't have the tools and the skills to do it when they were first promoted into it. They might actually say never again, and that can be completely career defining. So again, it's just another reason why it's so important. As we move on to the next slide, just to say, please do feel free to put any comments in the chat that we can pick up on. If anyone's got any experience of this, it would be amazing to hear whether you've had this experience yourself or whether managers in your organisation have given you this feedback. It'd be really useful if anyone wanted to share anything just while I'm moving to the next slide. So I'll keep the chat function open there if anybody wants to join in. So one thing that's a really key module from the Introduction to Management course is authenticity as a manager. Now, quite often what we find is that managers are promoted because they've got a whole range of really fabulous soft skills and technical skills that make them a great choice to become a manager. The decision to put somebody in a management role is rarely taken lightly. It's usually when you're choosing the right person with the right raw materials to become a manager at the time that's right for them. And so there's often all of these fantastic reasons why someone's promoted into management. But actually, without being authentic, that can derail a manager. And quite often what happens is when people are put into a management role, if they're not given the opportunity to learn and understand who they want to be as a manager, people can often feel that they need to take on a different persona in order to fulfill the different role. They know that they're going to potentially be expected to be more authoritative, make difficult decisions, expected to manage performance, and that can make people adopt a completely different sense of themselves to their actual real persona. So our key tips here are for you to have a really good think about what makes you you. Why were you promoted into a managerial position? What are the materials that you hold in yourself that people saw and thought of you to be a good manager? And what is it about you that you believe will make you a good manager? And have a really good think about that. And that will allow you to remember that you were promoted into this role for a reason, that you have been perceived to have all of the skills and raw materials that it takes to do the role. And once you've had a good think about what makes you you and what you think that was the reasons why you were promoted into management, then you can start to have a look at your personal brand. And what we mean by that in a managerial context is, what do you want to be famous for as a manager? When you think about it, there's so many different styles of management and leadership, and there's no broad brush, this is the right way to do it and this is the wrong way to do it, but it's all often about taking on board your own authentic self and bringing that into your role as a manager, because it's really hard to be a manager without being your authentic self, and your subordinates and your team and everyone around you will pick up on it. People can naturally tell if someone's not being authentic, and particularly this is the case if they know you already. So quite often managers are promoted to the role and they then will be taking on the position where previous people that were peers and colleagues will become their subordinates, and they'll be managing people that know them already. So it's going to be so obvious to your team and to your colleagues if you're not being your authentic self, because these people usually know you already. So think about your personal brand and who you want to be as a manager. Some people do this by reflecting on previous managers that they've had. Often people will learn from their experience of an amazing manager that they've had in the past and use them as a bit of a muse and a way to model yourself, and that can be a really useful thing. And on the flip side of that, a lot of people say that they've in the past experienced not so positive management and they've had managers with a style that hasn't worked particularly well. And again, you can learn from other people's mistakes too. So have a think about management that you've experienced, good or bad, anyone that's inspired you as a manager, and think about what it was about them that inspired you. And then think about what you want your personal brand as a manager to be, what you want to be famous for as a manager, all the while bringing in your authentic personality to that. It's so interesting when you see managers take on the role, and I will watch and observe when I'm working with and training new managers sometimes, and they will go into a one-to-one setting, for example, and all of a sudden this previously warm, dynamic, confident person will change completely in front of me into a much more maybe cold, aloof, stiff persona. Now, often it's because maybe they're nervous, because they're having to act and operate in a way that they haven't previously operated before. So often it's nerves. Sometimes it's just they feel they've got to be authoritative, so they take on a different sense of style and tone and persona when they're in that role. And we advise that it's really important just to try and reflect on going back a step, being your authentic self and relaying the message that you want to relay, but in your authentic way. Another common mistake that managers make is they will often hide behind, say, emails or other electronic communications, rather than having a conversation with their people. Now, this is really key because quite often managers will have loads of stuff that they want to put in place, but they won't necessarily have the tools for one-to-one or real-life conversations. So they will then start firing off lots of emails with stats on it and what they want to see and explaining to people how things are going to be. And that can really instill a lot of concern or fear or anxiety in the team around them. And they can worry that there's going to be a lot of change. And if anyone's ever been on the receiving end of change that might affect their role or the way that the team are doing things, and they've just received it in an email, we can probably all relate to the fact that that is potentially going to cause concern and worry and anxiety. So our tip here is to talk to your people. Now, there's various different communication methods that you might want to draw on, and we talk so much more about this in the full programme. But for example, if you've got a team that you're working with, and maybe you've inherited the team or you've been moved into a new team, you're likely to be managing a team of people. There'll be times when you want to talk to everybody together and get the team together for a group collective chat. But there will be other times when it should be a one-to-one as well. And you will naturally start to know what the best format for these communications are. But we would absolutely say, particularly at the beginning when you're getting to know the team and they're getting to know you, is to talk to them. Talk to them in person, and also just communicate consistently about the fact that you're in the new management role, about what the expectations are going to be, and ask the team if they want to share anything as well. This is a great opportunity to have their reflections and to have things bounced off back to you from the team about any concerns that they might have or anything that they want to know. This starts you off with a really open forum for communication, and it means that you're not just sending out emails which might have gone potentially into somebody's negative way of thinking when they've read it, and ensures that you get a positive message out there. So definitely make sure that you're talking to your people, especially from an early day. And next, tone and body language. And this one's particularly useful if potentially you're not used to addressing a group, and then all of a sudden you've got your team around you and you're addressing them as a group. Again, some people might notice that their tone can change, or their body language might change, or even their volume. And it's all about making sure that you are natural and authentic in your style. And one really good way to do this is to practice. 9 times out of 10, new managers who are suddenly faced with running a team meeting, unless they have got this amazing natural skill set already, which is rare that we see, will often come across in a way that they don't intend to. So practicing makes perfect. And a really good way to practice can be to video yourself. So often you'll find that managers will video themselves as part of our training, or we'll video them during the training, which is something we do in the course. And when they replay and watch the video back, they'll be actually really shocked and surprised by how they appeared. What the video does is it holds a mirror up to them, and they're able to see how they're perceived, which is so useful. Most of the time, managers will do it, and we'll ask them to critique themselves, and that way they're able to physically give feedback on their own delivery. And then they might do another couple of takes, and then by the third or fourth take, usually speaking, what you get is exactly how the manager wants to appear. They get back their natural warmth, their authenticity is there, and their message is then so much better received. So we recommend all new managers to practice anything that you're not comfortable doing or you haven't done before. Get in front of a video or mirror, but ideally a video, practice it, watch it back, and give yourself a really honest critique. Because although some people find videoing themselves or being videoed is uncomfortable, it's definitely a lot more uncomfortable being perceived in a way that you don't even realize because you haven't practiced it. And as I said before, it's very rare that a manager naturally comes into the role with these skills. A small percentage of people do. They will have these skills already, but usually speaking, it does take practice to get there. So when it comes to being authentic as a manager, have a really good think about the raw materials that make you a good person for the role. Think about your personal brand and what you want to be famous for as a manager. Remember to talk to your people rather than just communicate via email or other electronic communications. Have a think about whether it's one-to-one or a group setting, and just communicate with your people constantly. Watch your tone and body language, and our biggest tip here is to get in front of a video, practice and critique yourself. So before we move on from authentic management, again, anybody who wants to share anything in the chat, please do feel free. It'd be lovely to get anyone's thoughts. I've noticed somebody said that's a useful reminder. No, there are maybe a few blind spots. Yeah, I think we've all got blind spots. Thank you, Daniel. It's so true. We've all got blind spots. And the fact that they're blind spots means we're not aware of them. So the only way to become aware of them really is to hold a mirror up. Something else that your managers might want to do is to have a role play. Again, it can be just as useful as a video, if not more so, if there's somebody that you trust that you can role play with. Maybe your own manager, if they're giving you any coaching or mentoring, might be someone in HR, or it might be an external trainer potentially. But role plays are so useful because not only then are you able to video yourself, but you get the other person's side of it as well. You probably, if anyone's ever been on any of our courses, you know that we're big fans of role play, but it is such an effective way to embed this learning. So yeah, role play and videos are key here. So next we're going to be talking about delegation, and delegation is such an amazing tool for managers to utilize. There are so many benefits of delegating for both you as a manager and the team around you. So if you think about it, managers delegating is absolutely key for so many reasons, but there are certain things that you might not have thought of. Now, delegation will obviously, as a manager, save you time. That's the number one thing. If you're able to delegate tasks and duties, it can save you time. Now, this is really important when you think about it, because most often new managers will be promoted into a role of manager, and 80% of the time or more, they're still expected to do some of their previous responsibilities. So what it is it turns into a dual role. So you're becoming a manager and you're doing the job at the same time, which means that you're going to be busier, and it means that you are going to have a lot more work to do and a lot of things to fit in. When you're managing as well, particularly as a new manager, it's the people management side of things that you don't want to be rushing, because one big challenge that we find is feedback from managers when they're rushing the management stuff. They're not taking the time to really think about how they want to be as a manager. So a great way to ensure that new managers have the time to dedicate towards their new management responsibilities and their previous role, if they are doing a dual role, is to delegate. So that's a reason why delegation is key. But other things that you might not have thought of around delegation is that delegation is a really great way for a manager to assess the skills within their team. So you might not know what your team are capable of. You might have people that are really ambitious within your team who are really keen to take on more responsibilities. Now, delegating a piece of work to them doesn't mean that you're giving them a promotion or giving it to them forever, but it can allow you to give it to them as a one-off, assess their ability to do it, really check their strengths and skills, really understand whether they can fit that in as well as their other duties. And it can help you when you're thinking about any promotions or upward movements within your team. So that's another real benefit of delegation. But another key thing as well, which is so useful, is it can help create a balance of workload within any team. Now, there are often times in the team where somebody is too busy and some people are not busy enough. And it's often because of different levels within the team, maybe different stages of what people are at with their learning, and also depending on how new people are. Some people will naturally be busier in the team than others. Now, this can be fine, but it can lead to a real imbalance. And it can mean that the people that are really busy are actually really stressed and they're not enjoying their role. And it can mean that the people that aren't busy are also feeling stressed because they're not feeling productive, they're not feeling useful, and that can also lead to stress in the opposite way. Delegation as a manager can really help you to ensure that there's an equal balanced flow of work among your team. And it can mean that you are able to create a really high performing team that are communicating well, sharing workload, and most importantly, not feeling that stress of being either overworked or underutilized. So delegation is, as we've said, a really useful benefit to managers and can support the whole team. So when would you want to delegate? So there are various times when you might want to delegate, and it can always be decided by the manager when they think it's appropriate. But think about if there's an imbalance in your team, and think about if there's a massive new piece of work coming in, or when your workload is key and high, then you can think about you might want to delegate some of the tasks around the team. So our top tips of what to do when you're delegating are to think of the level of the person that you're delegating to. Now, it might be that you want to delegate something very menial and very maybe mundane, and that's absolutely fine. As a manager, I think you should be delegating those things where relevant. But have a think about the level of person you're delegating to. And if you are delegating something that's fairly basic and low level, maybe think of a newer or more junior team member to delegate that to. And on the flip side, if you're delegating something that needs a certain amount of experience, a certain amount of expertise, and a certain amount of knowledge, then definitely make sure you're delegating to somebody who's at the right level for that in terms of their experience. It's really important to make sure you're getting the level right with delegation. And then next we think about time. And what we mean by that is making sure that you're delegating early. It's sometimes really tempting to delegate something when it's a little bit too late, but it's not really fair to do that if you're too close to deadline, because what you're then doing is giving somebody an unworkable role or an unworkable project. And a way to start delegating early is to be thinking about delegating all of the time. So whenever a task comes into the inbox or into the team's inbox and you're in control of the workflow, have a think about whether it's something you should delegate before you let it sit in your inbox for 3 days or before you start to do the task yourself. Always run it through that filter of, should I be delegating this? Is there someone of the right level who I could delegate this to? Is there someone who's got enough capacity for me to delegate this to? And the earlier you start thinking about that means that you'll be in the mindset of delegation as early as possible, because delegating projects early on is absolutely key to success and not setting your people up to fail and making sure that you're ultimately getting the right outcomes. And clarity is also really key with delegating. So when you delegate, I would definitely recommend that you sit down with somebody and you have a conversation about what the expectation is and make sure that there's no ambiguity around it. So we want to get really clear. So what that might mean is sitting down, talking about what the task is, asking the person how they think they're going to resource the task, checking that you think that's the right way to do it, giving them any advice you think they might need or any resource that they might need, giving them any wider context around the task so that they can see the bigger picture and understand everything they need to know to go away and do it. So make it really clear. The other thing we say when you're delegating the task is to agree a timeline. So again, when you've ensured that the person's at the right level, they've got capacity, and you've got clarity on how they're going to go about the task, another really important thing is to ensure that you sit with a timeline when you expect it back by, or when you expect the first stage of it back by, just to make sure that you're giving really smart objectives and it's super clear. And then finally, another thing that quite often we forget when delegating is we've delegated the task, it's brilliant, we can take it off our list, we're really busy and run on and do the next thing that we need to do. But actually, delegation isn't about abdicating responsibility. And realistically, it's important to keep it on your list. It's something that ultimately you're still responsible for, but you're resourcing it in a different way through the team. So keeping it on your list will mean that your team and you will never slip, because you'll be able to make sure that you're checking in on it. But you're still, when you're keeping it on your list, saving a huge amount of time by arranging for somebody else to do the delivery on it and report back to you. So they're the top delegation tips or do's within delegation. And there are also some things that are quite useful to avoid when you're delegating. So I think it's fair to say it's rarely appropriate to delegate a crisis. Usually speaking, when there's a crisis, it will need to be handled by you, and your expertise as a manager will be required to deal with this crisis. So it's unlikely that you're going to be able to delegate a crisis. What you can, however, do if a crisis comes up, which, as we know, sometimes they do, sometimes you'll get something hit you and it's something that you absolutely have to deal with, and it might be a challenge and it might throw the rest of your day out. It might be something you'd love to delegate, but realistically, you know that you need to do it. But what you can do in that case is delegate other things. So more business as usual, more day-to-day things, more things that you know there are people on the team that can take on to give you the room and the bandwidth to deal with this crisis and ensure that it doesn't become something that overflows the team. So yeah, there might be times when there's somebody senior in your team where you can delegate a crisis, but only you will know that, and it would need to be a senior person with expertise. But otherwise, don't think you have to deal with everything yourself. When something comes in that's unexpected, delegate the more basic tasks to give you the bandwidth and the time to do it and ensure that you and your team are winning even in challenging times. Never too late. So we talked earlier about the benefits of delegating early on with any task, but it's also important to remember that it can be really damaging to delegate too late. If you're sitting there with something that's now one day from deadline that you've been sitting on, it's going to be too late to be delegating. So as we said before, get in a delegation mindset, get yourself thinking about delegating all the time, put it through the delegation filter as soon as it comes in. Should I be delegating this? And get it done in time so you're never too late. And also try not to be dull with delegating. What we mean by that is often people that are keen to take on more tasks are really keen to step upwards and see whether they're able to take on things that they wouldn't normally be at the level to take on. As we've said before, it's a great way to trial your team's ability to step up. So try wherever possible to delegate interesting stuff. And things that people want to take on. It doesn't mean you can't delegate more menial stuff, as we've talked about before. We think that's important for a manager to do as well. But try and give your team members interesting things that are going to stretch them and challenge them where possible, because that will raise their level of interest and allow you to see whether there's somebody that could be taking these things on more and more. Stay out of the grey, and this is all about not being grey with expectations. Don't just fire off an email and expect somebody to know what you're asking for. Be super clear, have a conversation, ideally a face-to-face, where you get the opportunity to explain the context, explain the background, tell them exactly what the task is, tell them when you need it back by, and then importantly, get their feedback. So ask them how they plan to resource this particular task, what they plan to do, discuss their plan with them, and if you see any challenges, discuss their challenges with them and share that with them, and make sure that you leave that meeting with absolutely no grey area on what's expected, and that you and the person you're delegating to is really clear on the next steps. And then finally, we think it's really important to think about confidentiality when delegating. Now, this is something which people are challenged with quite often, and it can be as simple as asking somebody to shred something, because you normally would just give your shredding to someone else, but as a manager, your shredding might now include super confidential information, it might be that you need to think of another way to do that, or even do this yourself if there's nobody that's looped into the confidentiality aspects. So really have a think, even if it's something that you really want to delegate, there might be things that aren't appropriate to be shared internally, or there might only be certain people in the team that you can delegate to who are able to be exposed to this confidential information. So just have a think about any confidentiality before delegating so that you don't come up against any challenges with that later down the line. So there's our top do's and don'ts for delegation, and also a recap on the benefits and when to use delegation. Daniel, I think you've had a comment there, so talking a bit about face-to-face meetings. It would be great to get your insight into that. Is that you as a manager where you've had challenges with face-to-face meetings, or is that team members? It'd be great to hear from you a bit further on that one. Thank you. While Daniel's just replying there, I'm going to move on to the next slide where we're talking about feedback. So feedback is a massive part of management, and it's something that comes up for us really often. Quite often new managers are aware that they're going to have to be giving feedback, and they also sometimes feel that they lack the tools to give feedback. So we're going to be talking all about feedback, but I'm just going to come back to Daniel's question. Thanks so much, Daniel. So Daniel's talking about drawing the line between personal and work. Understood. Yeah. And this is a really interesting one, Daniel, and thank you for sharing that. One-to-ones can be a challenge for new managers, particularly if it's people that were former friends or colleagues of yours, and all of a sudden now you're managing these people. It's about knowing how formal and informal to be. And it is definitely something that we recommend practicing and role-playing and really thinking through and understanding that the dynamic has changed, but you as a person don't have to change. And this is something we spend a lot of time on in the full course because it is such a common challenge that people face. But thanks for sharing, Daniel. That's such useful insight. So going back to feedback, feedback matters. And it's really interesting. I always love to use the analogy about Olympic athletes. So Olympic athletes, when they work with their coach, if they knew that their coach knew something that they were doing that was holding back their performance and their coach wasn't telling them, these athletes would be absolutely furious because all they want is to be the best they can be, and they heavily rely on their coach to help them to be the best they can be. But it's interesting how in management, feedback is sometimes feared or not accepted widely, and it's definitely something which comes up a lot. People sometimes are reticent to receive feedback and they're reticent to give feedback. If you think, though, about the Olympic athlete analogy, it does make you realise you want to be the best you can be, your people want to be the best they can be, and you want to have the most high-performing team that you can. And once you have a system set up where there's a really open forum for giving and receiving of feedback among the team, it means that you can start to deliver really high-performing results and become an amazingly performing team where everyone's facing the same direction and everyone's aiming for the same goal. And it does all really start with feedback. So we do recommend all new managers to get comfortable with giving feedback, both the good and the bad. And again, we do a lot of work around role playing and practicing the giving and receiving of feedback to ensure that you can maintain your authenticity and get your message across without unsettling the team. And what you ultimately want to get to is a 360 feedback where your team members are giving each other feedback, they're peer sharing feedback, they're giving you feedback, and everyone is really comfortable with it. But new managers sometimes take a little while to get to that point. But if you can get to that point, it's going to be amazing for your team, your team's reputation, and what your team can achieve together. So we talk about knowing your style as a manager, and particularly around feedback. And I think this is really important because when we work with new managers, it's almost always the case that you either veer towards a more preference for giving constructive and negative feedback, and you're not at all concerned about saying when something isn't right, or you're much more leaning towards being happy to give positive feedback. So you're somebody who is really happy to share wins and say to somebody that was amazing, but you're not necessarily as comfortable giving the negative feedback. Most managers will fall into one or the other of those categories, especially when they start out. So we would say that for anyone starting out in management, try to get your feedback giving balanced and try to remember to give as much of the positive as the negative, or vice versa, depending on what your natural bent is, where you're naturally leaning. Try and get it to be as balanced as possible. And that's something that people have to learn. Some people really do struggle initially with giving negative or constructive feedback, whereas others that just don't, it doesn't come easily to them to shout about the wins, but they're more likely to pick up on what's going wrong. So definitely trying to find some balance in there will really help you to get the best out of your team, because constructive and positive feedback are equally important, as we're going to talk about now. So tips for giving constructive feedback, which can be the hardest for some people. If you do have something you need to feedback to a team member, I would always say it's important to prepare that. So just like before, it's about practice makes perfect. And so often managers are so busy and they're desperately trying to get to grips with the management role, look after all of their direct reports, manage the workflow within the team and manage their own workflow. One of the things that often gets forgotten or missed is the opportunity to prepare and practice. But it is so important, and particularly if there is something that you need to relay which isn't so nice and positive and it is more of constructive feedback, we definitely recommend taking the time to prepare. Don't just walk into that meeting without having prepped, because it can end up being difficult for you and your team member. And it is something that can sometimes be hard to pull back from. It can be hard to wind back from these mistakes. And these are things that people make really early on when they haven't been given training. If you can avoid it, then it's great. It is possible to pull back from it. And we do a lot of work with people in the long version of this course about how you can unwind from managerial mistakes you've made early on, because not all of us get it right first time. Absolutely. Even when you've had training, you can make mistakes. But if you can get it right at the beginning, it's so useful. So preparation is key here. Now, we talk about the right time and place, and this is actually also really worth considering. Now, it might just be that you can pop over to somebody's desk and have a couple of words with them. This is when it's something that's constructive feedback, but it's not super serious. It's not going to unsettle them or dethrow them from what they're doing. But it might be more realistic that if you're giving constructive feedback, that you might want to arrange a time and a place for that. So we would say it's probably best to arrange a chat, arrange a one-to-one or a catch-up with the person, and make sure that it's in a place where you can be not overheard, where it's discreet and where it's confidential. So you can have the conversation with this person without anyone overhearing. You don't want your team member to be embarrassed by somebody listening to this conversation. So set the right time and place and prepare in advance for the meeting. And then once you get into the meeting, it's very important to depersonalize. And this all comes down to thinking about how you're delivering the message. And it's just simple things like thinking a little bit about the words that you use, for example. It's quite useful to say things like, we would love to see, rather than you always do this. Think about the words and think about how you would receive the words if you were on the receiving end of them, and make sure you're not personalizing. So try not to use I and you, but using we as a manager can be really useful. It makes people then think of the wider management team and the organization rather than what you as a manager want to see. And it's also little things like using we instead of I are useful tools for the manager, particularly when you're new to giving and receiving feedback. Just using that language can create a little bit of a buffer between you and the message that you're delivering. So have a think about any ways that you can depersonalize the message, just to ensure that the person knows that you're dealing with the issue and not the person. Make sure you're working the issue and not the person is absolutely key to depersonalize. Think about your tone, pace and volume as well. Some people are naturally loud and they naturally talk quickly and they naturally talk fast. Other people are slower. It's a really good idea to mirror the person that you're with to make them feel comfortable, particularly when you're having to share with them something that's not so popular or not so positive. If you slow down or speed up or match them a little bit, it can make them feel more comfortable, and just that comfort can psychologically make them more able to take on what you're saying without becoming defensive or upset. So just have a think about tone, pace and volume and what's appropriate. And another thing that's really important, which new managers often forget, is to allow for a response. So managers can sometimes go in and be prepared for what they want to say, but they won't necessarily have left room for what somebody else wants to say. And we all know the importance of being heard. We all know that if we go into a meeting and somebody's giving us constructive feedback, we want the opportunity to be heard, to maybe talk about what you're hearing, ask for examples, think about your experience of it. And so giving people an opportunity to respond and a right to reply is really important with any constructive feedback that you're giving. And then finally, it's about agreeing an outcome. So it's really important to go in and have these conversations, and quite often we'll forget at the end that actually what we need to do is signpost an outcome that we want to reach. And to agree, I think, is the key word there for you and your team member to agree on an outcome. And a great way to do that is to put it back to them and say, how would you suggest we deal with this? What would you like to do? And how do you think we can resolve this? Doing that will give them ownership, and it will make them realize that actually they are being heard in this. They've got a voice, and it's not just you telling them what you want to see, but asking them how they want to resolve it. We hire really impressive people, and when something goes wrong, it doesn't mean that they've lost all of their skills. These people have ideas about how to resolve it, and the more you allow them to think about how they want to resolve the situation means they're going to have this ownership around it, and they're going to want to get it resolved. Whereas if you just tell them what you want, it's less likely that you're going to agree on a positive outcome. So definitely try and agree an outcome with them, and then also signpost next steps as well. So what you don't want to do is just tell them and then leave it there, because if this situation happens again, it can be difficult to reopen the dialogue. So if you have then set another meeting, maybe for a week's time or a month's time, or whatever it is that's appropriate to the particular issue that you're dealing with, set another meeting, keep the door open. And it can be a great opportunity to sit with them in a week or a month's time, and then they will have improved this issue. They've done what they've said they're going to do. They'll talk you through it. And they might have even had an epiphany in the process as well. And they would then see you as a real inspirational leader because you've helped them to overcome a problem. It can actually, when you work with these issues with a team member, really build your management relationship with them. But really, it's only able to do that if you're keeping the door open and you're continuing to talk about it. So set a meeting or another conversation or a deadline in place for when you want to address it again, or when you'd like it to be resolved by, or when they suggest it to be resolved by, so that you can keep the door open on the conversation. And then finally, we're going to be talking about positive feedback. So positive feedback is, as we've said before, just as important as constructive feedback. And in some cases, it might be a bit forgotten, because if there's an issue, you know, you've got to deal with the issue. But if things are going well, you might forget that these things are areas that also need to be addressed as well. So when it comes to positive feedback, there's a few really key tips. Now, the first one is knowing your team members' preferences. And this actually all comes down to knowing your team members, which again, in the long course, we talk a lot about understanding your people, understanding their personality style, and really getting to know them so you can be the best manager for that person. But when we're talking about it in a feedback context, what we mean is knowing their feedback preferences. Now, everyone has different feedback preferences, and it might be or might not be something that you've thought about. But some people, believe it or not, really don't like public feedback, and they actually get really embarrassed about it. So they really might not want you to stand up in front of the whole team and say, hello, everybody, Jenny's just done this amazing piece of work. We've got great feedback from the client, and I wanted to share it with everybody. Some people, however, will absolutely love that, and it will be part of their profile that they crave public praise and feedback. Knowing your team's feedback preferences means that you can shape the feedback you give them to ensure that it's best for them and get the best out of them. There's no point giving someone really great feedback because you want it to be a win for them if they're sitting there cringing and they really are uncomfortable with public praise. But equally, if you just send someone an email saying, great, well done, that was a really good job, and there's somebody that does like to be publicly praised, then that's not going to hit the right spot either. So know your people's feedback preferences. And the best way to do that is to ask them. And it's a really nice conversation to have early on in management, is to talk to people about their style and their preferences, and their feedback preference is a key one to talk to them about when you're getting to know your people. Think about a group or private setting, as we've talked about, same as you would for constructive feedback. Remember that not everybody enjoys group feedback, or some people prefer private feedback, so just have a think about that. And then also cascading the information. So when somebody's done a really good job, it's great that their manager knows it, and it's great that their team knows it, but it can also be useful to cascade it to the wider team or the wider organisation, depending on your setup. But think about whether it's relevant for you to share this information with others. If, for example, you've got a really high performer in your team and you know that you want to give them some sort of promotion or step up or the next step on their roadmap, then cascading the information to the senior leadership team, for example, is a really good way to help ensure that this person has been publicly profiled and is somebody that is seen by the wider audience as a positive. So when you approach them to say you think this person should be promoted, there'll already be a positive noise around that. If you're hiding all of their achievements, then it can be harder for you to get this person the promotion that they're due. So that's something to think about. And then also think about what more they can do. When somebody does an amazing piece of work, have a think about maybe other things that you could delegate to them. And also have a think about their career progression. As a manager, one of the key things is knowing when your team are ready for that next step and ensuring that people don't stay in a role and that they don't get too bored, or that they don't, feel frustrated because they're not being pushed. Knowing when to push and challenge people and put them into the next stage is really powerful. And understanding their achievements is one of the strongest ways to do that, as well as delegation that we talked about earlier. So that's feedback covered. Some useful tips, I hope, in there. As I say, it's so much more beneficial in the long course when there's the opportunity to really understand all of this. But even this, I think if you can take these tips on board and share them with your team members, it's so super useful around feedback. So again, please do feel free to pop anything in the chat before we move on to the next slide. So similar to giving constructive feedback is difficult conversations. And one of the top things that new managers are challenged by is difficult conversations. And it's really useful to be able to work with managers and show them that there are templates for dealing with difficult conversations. Now, difficult conversations as a manager aren't always going to be with your team. It could be with anybody. It might be with your superiors. It might be with a senior team. It might well be with a team member. It might be with somebody who's equal to you, and it might be someone external, a client or a supplier. Essentially, the more senior you go in an organisation, the more likely you are to be getting involved in difficult conversations. And actually, difficult conversations is a module for everybody. It's definitely not just managers that need this training. So definitely this is something that you can share with any of your team members if you think it would be useful for them. But it is absolutely up there with the things that people say that they're challenged by when they take on a management role. And it can be one of the things that people really fall down when they're given this new promotion. So first of all, it's important to be prepared. So when you're approaching a difficult conversation, like everything else we've talked about today, it's all about preparation and practice, making sure that you know exactly what it is that you are going to be discussing, what it is that you want to get out of it as well, to ensure that you're prepared and you go in there with a plan. Very similar to giving negative or non-popular feedback is how you prepare for a difficult conversation. And again, practice makes perfect. So if there is a particularly difficult conversation, it is likely that you're going to be feeling some discomfort around it, and that might well come through in your delivery. So again, if you can possibly spare the time, I would always recommend a bit of practice, maybe a role play, maybe working on a video and critiquing yourself, but think about the particular issue and the conversation that you've got to have and really practice it and be prepared for it. And when we talk about being prepared, it's also about preempting the other person's point of view and thinking about what challenges they might throw at you during the conversation so that you've got every angle covered as well of things that might potentially go wrong. Again, similar to constructive feedback, during a difficult conversation, it's important to give the person the opportunity for reflection. But also, it might not just be in the meeting. Reflection and headspace can come after the conversation. So it's about leaving a door open. And it's a little bit like saying, let's sleep on this, particularly if in the conversation you're not reaching an outcome that's mutually agreeable, you're not getting to a point where everybody is feeling that they're on the same page. A little bit of time, a little bit of reflection, and a bit of headspace is so useful for utilising within a difficult conversation. And you can even say, let's go away, let's sleep on this, let's both think about it. I'd love the chance to reflect on this. It would be amazing if you'd be able to reflect on this too. Let's both think about it and let's come back in the room. That's a great way to diffuse a situation, particularly when a difficult conversation isn't coming to a positive outcome. Avoiding personalization or emotion is really key, and it's similar to how we talked about before, but for a particularly difficult conversation, emotions can really get in your way. And this is why we say be prepared and take the time to prepare. If something happens which is a trigger for you and it's something which you jump straight into to dealing with there and then, you can sometimes regret it. I would always say to buy a little bit of time around the conversation and not jump straight in if you are feeling at all emotive or triggered. Something might happen and you think you need to deal with it and respond there and then, but there's always the benefit of a bit of hindsight and taking a deep breath, taking a step back and going into the difficult conversation later when you're prepared and when you've had a chance to calm down. If you jump straight in, you're very likely to have emotion attached to your delivery, and that is never something that you want when it's a business message that you're trying to relay. Difficult conversations delivered with emotion can be really antagonistic and psychologically very difficult for a team member to deal with. So always try to avoid emotion and personalization within a difficult conversation. And I can't say it enough, the best way to do that is to buy yourself time and not think you need to deal with it there and then, particularly if there is any emotion that you're feeling around it as well. It's really powerful to have the benefit of that time and distance yourself, give yourself a buffer between that emotion and how you deliver it to your team members. Absolutely key. Again, thinking about your tone, speed and volume. Now, delivering a difficult message or having a difficult conversation can be really challenging, and it can be challenging for the person to hear it as well. If you're going in loud, aggressive, fast, and with an abrupt tone, that can completely change how something is delivered. And it's as simple as saying, "This is really serious," or saying, "This is really serious." If you think about it, you're saying exactly the same words, but delivering it in a calmer tone, which is less emotive. It's less likely to get somebody frustrated and more likely for your message to land, and then for this person to feel like there's somewhere that they can come back from and come back with a more constructive response. So really think about it. I actually think it's possible to deliver any message, no matter how difficult, by using your tone, speed and volume appropriately. It can really diffuse and calm the situation down. And it's something to play with. Some managers will be better at this than others, and some will need more practice. And some people's tone might naturally be faster and louder and harder. And learning to slow that down, to calm it down, can really help you to win the room and get people on side and help them to see the way through this difficult conversation. And also, again, choosing your words is really useful. We might not realise that some words can be emotive and inflammatory. And the best way to do it is just to check them. Think about how you'd feel. Think about your point of view if somebody used these words in the conversation with you. And then there's 9 times out of 10 a word that's going to be still delivering the message in the right way, but less emotive, and allow for the message to land in a much more palatable way. So that, again, is a really quick version of difficult conversations. I'm conscious of the time, but again, during our training, it's something that we spend a lot of time on. We spend a lot of time on role play, we spend a lot of time on demos, and we spend a lot of time on how to deliver difficult conversations effectively. And that will take us on to the end of the slide. So as with all of our courses, what we urge you to do, even after the taster session today, is have a little think about any of your top takeaways, anything that you want to start doing differently as a result of what you've learned today. There's usually, we find something, 1 or 2 things that really stand out. And if you've got time, it would be amazing to have a little think about anything that's really stood out for you today, so that you can make sure that this has been a useful use of your time and something that you can take on board into your role with you. And on that note, if anybody did want to put in the chat any of their top takeaways from today just before we finish up, that would be great. It'd be amazing to hear if anyone's got anything that they found today that was useful. Mira, thank you for your message. So you said, what about receiving feedback as a manager and how employees may manage up? So this is absolutely key, Mira. And in the group programs, we talk a lot about management feedback. It can be challenging for new managers to ask for feedback from their team, but we do recommend it, and we recommend you work towards a point where you're asking for feedback as well. And it's something that you will start setting up, is this forum of feedback and people feeling really comfortable with feedback. Feedback doesn't feel like a negative anymore, even if it is negative feedback. So the more you can get a flow of feedback going and a continual feedback loop, then the easier it is to manage up as well. And feedback to the senior team, I think that you're touching on here, is also really, really important. When you're a manager, there will be times when you also have to have conversations upwards and give feedback upwards as well. And again, that's something that we do a lot of work around scenarios in role playing. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I really do hope that you got something useful from today. It's really great to have so many of you in the room today. Thank you. And oh, Abby's sharing her key takeaways. So how to manage emotions with conversations, delivering messages by being prepared. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Abby. That one is a real game changer for a lot of people that we work with. And taking emotion out of it is really, really powerful. And what we're also told quite often is that people find that this isn't just useful at work, but can be useful in real life as well. So people often find that they go home and it's something they try with their husband or something, and you find that you get a better response at home as well as using it in work. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for your time today. We are nearly at the hour mark, so we're going to leave it there. But if anybody does want to have a further conversation or had any questions, feel free to drop me an email. My details are here, or give me a call. And, you know, I love talking about this stuff, so it'd be a pleasure to talk to any of you about it afterwards. Thanks, everybody. Bye.